Hi everyone, today I'm going to rank and discuss 7 books by H.G. Wells, the English science fiction writer, with an emphasis on motifs, reoccurring themes that repeat throughout his books. Number 7 is The First Men in the Moon. This book is about 2 men from the early 1900s who land on the moon. Now, one is the corporal embodiment of capitalism, a businessman named Bedford. And the other is the embodiment of science, a guy named Cavor, the scientist who invented the technology to reach the moon. On the moon, these 2 guys encounter an alien race named the Selenites. This book has some recurring themes found in other of Wells' books. Like the aliens in War of the Worlds and the Eloi and the Morlocks from the Time Machine, the Selenites too had eradicated all diseases. Also, the Morlocks and the Selenites both lived underground. That was another parallel. It's a very similar story to the Time Machine and War of the Worlds, except instead of visiting the future, they visit the moon, and instead of the aliens visiting the humans, it's the humans who visit the aliens. Not to suggest H.G. Wells isn't a versatile writer, as you'll see it later in the video, H.G. Wells was very eclectic in his writings. But this book shares the theme of colonialism with War of the Worlds. War of the Worlds, as I'll explain more later, was an allegory for colonialism and eugenics, and so was this book. Without giving too much away, I would say one of the morals to the story is that we, as a society, will get what we want from other societies, nothing more and nothing less. If we want gold from the countries we colonize, or rather, the Brits in the early 1900s colonized, then that's all they'll get, and nothing more. If they want to learn from other countries and cultures, learn their language, learn their customs and social structures, then they'll get that. And Wells gave the Selenites a unique social structure. The Selenites would be born into their jobs. They were very efficient workers. If they laughed, it would be for their job. If their job required thinking, their brains would be huge. If they were manual laborers, their arms would be huge. If they had no more work, they would hibernate. They had a division of labor similar to that of ants or bees, and had no concept of stuff like democracy. The Selenites were also flimsier adversaries than they appeared. They looked intimidating, but because gravity on Earth was heavier than on the moon, the Selenites could be pushed around with ease. I thought that was the moral of the story, that you can take a foreign civilization's gold, or you can go with an open mind and learn from them. I thought that was the moral of the story, until it wasn't. And I'll just leave it at that. I won't say any more than just that. Overall, I ranked this book last because I didn't find it as entertaining or suspenseful or as deep as H.G. Wells' other books, but his other books set the bar pretty high. Before we move on to the next book, I want to remark on a scene from this book. I don't want to end the video without talking about this scene. So there's a scene where the 2 guys were ascending to the moon. Bedford, the embodiment of capitalism guy, he started to get an existential mood. The Earth was so minuscule, they were so high up in space, that the Earth was really tiny from where they were, and he began to figuratively forget that Earth ever existed. So Cavor suggested he read the newspaper, quote, that copy of Lloyd's News might help you, end of quote. So Bedford started to read it and found a bunch of advertisements, a guy offering to lend money, another guy selling a bicycle, a lady trying to dispose of some fish knives. He found everything so silly, and he laughed and dropped the newspaper. This tidbit is another reoccurring theme in H.G. Wells' books. The time traveler also had an existential experience. So did everyone on Earth in the days of the Comet. A lot of H.G. Wells' characters contextualize life in a grand scheme and find our menial lives something to laugh about. The fact that in this case it was brought about by traveling to the moon reminds me of astronaut Edgar Mitchell from Apollo 14, who saw Earth from the moon and later said, quote, "From out there on the moon, international politics looks so petty. You want to grab a politician by the scruff of the neck and drag him 250,000 miles out and say, 'Look at that, you son of a—'" End of quote. Real life sometimes imitates art. Number 6 is The Food of the Gods. The Food of the Gods I don't think was supposed to be as deep as some of H.G. Wells' other books. It's a series of little stories surrounding this new invention, the food of the gods, that makes babies grow up to be giants, and insects and animals also grow into giants. I don't think there was a single main character. We see, for example, the adventures of the villagers getting attacked by giant insects, or a politician trying to use the opportunity to gain power, or Romeo and Juliet story arc. This is another book by H.G. Wells with the theme of something bringing about a new era. Like in The Age of the Comet, it was the comet, and in The Food of the Gods, it was the food. It's Pandora's box, an invention which cannot be uninvented, and suddenly all these humans find themselves in a Kafkaesque world that is too big for them. And suddenly there's a stronger race of humans whose mere existence is perceived as a threat. In terms of today, I think there's a lot of parallels. We can't uninvent the smartphone. We can't uninvent September 11th. We can't uninvent the Cerveza virus or cryptocurrencies or facial recognition or social media or reality TV. And suddenly the world has turned into a giant place and we've remained too minuscule. I think the main merits of this book is its entertainment value and suspense. But me personally, I couldn't really get into it. Now, before we move on to book number 5, I want to thank all the new subscribers, everyone who's subscribed to my channel, and everybody who commented on the Dostoevsky video or my other videos. Thank you so much for the warm words. It's so encouraging, and it's the reason why, even though I took a pretty long hiatus, I have been reading. I do plan on posting more videos, and it's thanks to you guys. Number 5 is In the Days of the Comet. In the Days of the Comet is about a world like our world, with all its flaws and social problems. But one day a comet flies by, and a mysterious green vapor from the comet turns people into better, utopian people. From one moment to the next, the world becomes a utopia. Soldiers abandon their weapons, politicians declare world peace, capitalist business owners apologize to their competitors for their vitriolic competition, and people lose their envy and jealousy and hate towards one another, all because of this mysterious green fog from the comet. The main character of the story is a young man, a socialist that reads Nietzsche who falls in love with a girl. She, however, falls in love with another man, a richer man. And so the main character decides he's going to murder them both and then kill himself. Now, here comes the spoilers. I can't really discuss this in depth without giving it away. The rest of this section will have a lot of spoilers. I'll give you a moment to decide if you want to skip to the next book. The timestamp is in the description. Or you want to hear the spoilers. Once he finds the runaway couple, he starts shooting at them, trying to kill them, but misses. Now, the green vapor that I've been talking about, that I talked about in the intro, that green vapor finally gets to Earth and it engulfs him, and he falls asleep along with the rest of the world. Now, once humanity wakes up, they are transformed into the new utopian people. This utopian world was yet another opportunity for H.G. Wells to describe his idea of a utopia. So it's interesting to see what H.G. Wells' utopia would look like. In this example of the world after the comet, the utopia, there was no more combustion of coal. So that was interesting to read that even back then, this was published in 1906, even back then they disliked coal. He also writes, there were no more roadways like grassless open scars along the earth from which dust pours out perpetually. Now that seems a little extreme to me. No more roadways? How are people supposed to get around? In fact, it says, quote, then we had the whole of the superseded steam railway system to scrap and get rid of. Stations, signals, fences, rolling stock, a plant of ill-planned, smoke-distributing nuisance apparatus. End of quote. So I get it, transportation sucks. Dirt roads pick up dust, trains expel smoke, but it's a necessary evil. How are people supposed to get around? I don't know. In this utopia, they also burned and destroyed most of their private buildings. Their boots, because they hurt your feet, their clothes, because most of people's clothes back then were dirty and they were made dark to conceal stains. They also destroyed all the woodwork, all their furniture, except a few score thousand pieces of distinct and intentional beauty. So I guess H.G. Wells thought the perfect world could do without most woodwork and furniture except for the really beautiful artisan furniture. H.G. Wells also took this opportunity to criticize some other things. For example, he criticized the uglification of the coast. He criticized how the iron masters produced more iron than there was demand for. And he also had an interesting observation about newspapers. He said, before the comet, pre-Utopia, the newspapers were filled with advertisements that provided the whole funding for the newspaper to exist. And these advertisements were for drugs that promised to fix the ailments that the other advertisements were causing. One of the craziest scenes in H.G.WELLS' Utopia was a scene where a bunch of Lord Chancellors, politicians, have a meeting and they start confessing their corruption. He wrote, quote, Garker protruded into the discussion, swaying forward, a deep throaty voice, a big nose, a coarse mouth with drooping, averted lower lip, eyes peering amidst folds and wrinkles. He made his confession for his race. Quote, we Jews, he said, have gone through the system of this world, creating nothing, consolidating many things, destroying much. Our racial self-conceit has been monstrous. We seem to have used our ample coarse intellectuality for no other purpose than to develop and master and maintain the convention of property, to turn life into a sort of mercantile chess and spend our winnings grossly. We have had no sense of service to mankind. Beauty, which is Godhead, we made into a possession. End of quote. When I read that, I was pretty shocked. You know, this was written in 1906, and even back then, these stereotypes were prevalent. It actually reminded me of the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, where there was a scene in that book, you know, the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, where Franklin and the other settlers had to make a treaty with the Indians at Carlisle. But they knew the Indians had a tendency to get too drunk. So they made a rule that nobody should sell the Indians any alcohol, and if the Indians remained sober during the treaty, they would get plenty of rum after it was over. So the Indians, they conducted themselves throughout the treaty all orderly, and then they claimed their rum in the afternoon. By the evening, the Indians had already made a huge bonfire and were all drunk, fighting and having a party. Now that was written around 1790, and even then, they had these stereotypes which have prevailed all these years. I'm always taken aback when I read stuff like that. Now, would you believe me if I told you that that's not even the most controversial passage in the book? The most controversial part of this utopia is that the main character ends up in a polyandrous relationship. It's all very logical. The idea is that love always brings about heartbreak, right? Wells wrote that, quote, love was always kind of cruel. They closed each other in their arms and locked the world outside, end of quote. As I mentioned earlier, the main character of this book was tangled in a love triangle. And so what would be the solution if two men love the same woman? You know, the real world has a finite number of women, a scarcity of resources. So what's the solution in the perfect utopia? What would be the solution if two men love the same woman? Well, in this story, they enter into a polyandrous relationship where after the comet brings about utopia, and after everyone wakes up from their sleep, the main character is fine sharing the girl he loves. Before the comet, it was totally different. He was going to do a double murder-suicide, remember? He was just about to shoot them, and he shot them, and he missed. But after the comet, he was fine sharing her. And then when the main character gets married to another woman, both couples, so all four people, become, quote, personal lovers in a world of lovers. Now here's the way I see it. You want to live in a world without heartbreak? Yeah, that would be pretty nice, wouldn't it? Think of all the sadness we could spare ourselves without any heartbreak in the world. But what's the cost? Well, H.G.WELLS was a socialist, as you'll hear ad infinitum for the remainder of the video. He was an ardent socialist. And he made the main character of this book a socialist too. And there's a sort of romantic socialism going on, or am I misunderstanding it? Well, you want to end hunger? Then you give up your food to the poor. You want to end homelessness? Then you give up your house. You want to end all romantic hardship? Then you give up your wife for the communal pile. I think the ultimate source of the problem is that we live in a world with scarcity of resources. So when you insert perfect, pristine humans into an imperfect world, you get this incongruity, this discrepancy. It's an age-old discrepancy that philosopher Ayn Rand, yes, Ayn Rand, actually tackled in her own personal life in the real world. Ayn Rand was a strict rationalist. She named her philosophy objectivism because she believed there's an objective reality. She also devised a moral code based on logical reason that could be objectively validated. I'm going to do a video soon on one of her books, The Virtue of Selfishness. Here's the thing. Ayn Rand, she was married and fell in love with a younger man who was already married. His name was Nathaniel Branden. I also did a video on one of his books. Anyways, as she explained in her book, rational men who truly think rationally do not have conflicting desires. Two rational men would never fight over the same toy. So she applied this principle that we've been talking about in the book. She applied it to her personal conundrum, and she went and told her husband that it was rational for her to have an affair with Nathaniel Branden. And she had a conversation with Nathaniel Branden's wife that an affair would be totally rationally justified, and there should be no objections. Their spouses sanctioned the affair. They allowed Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden to have an affair. And obviously, if you know anything about Ayn Rand, it did not end well. The breakup was acrimonious. But again, as Ayn Rand concluded that rational adults would have no scruples with infidelity, so too the utopian people of H.G.WELLS' book had no qualms with voluntary polyandry. H.G.WELLS and Ayn Rand probably don't share many views in common, with this one exception. Also, there's something to be said about the new Soviet man. You know how true communism would bring about a change in people, and they would become this concept of the new Soviet man who would not just be a communist, but also athletic and a master of his feelings, healthy and selfless. It would be a change in this person's character. Communism would change the person so that the person would want to live an athletic life and have no interest in crime and bad habits. And a lot of ideologies have this. Like I mentioned, objectivists have the Randian hero, the Howard Rourke. Nietzsche had the Ubermensch, Schopenhauer had the sage, and so on. I'm not saying H.G.WELLS relied on the new Soviet man, because that would be anachronistic. I'm saying that in this book, In the Days of the Comet, this utopia could only come about with an intrinsic change in people's character. They had to completely shed their jealousy and envy and human nature in order for this utopia to come about. As he put it, quote, "In a manner it had dehumanized the world, robbed it of its spites, its little intense jealousies, its inconsistencies, its humor," end of quote. There's also a lot of cultural relativism undertones in this book. The post-Comet utopian humans are at another plane than us humans. Their morality is above our comprehension. They just think in a different paradigm. And H.G.WELLS has a lot of cultural relativism in his books. The First Men in the Moon and War of the Worlds both dealt a lot with another alien race that are in a different social plane than us. In The Time Machine, the Eloi and the Morlocks are more a consequence of class division than a society beyond our moral reproach. So I think the last one, The Time Machine, isn't so much about cultural relativism, but the first two are. If H.G.WELLS predicted poison gas in the War of the Worlds, then I think he kind of predicted modern queer theory in this book, another socialist product. I don't know, maybe that's a stretch. But one thing is for sure, he definitely predicted that Germany and the UK would go to war. This book was published 8 years before it happened in World War I, although I guess a lot of people of the time could have predicted that. I'm currently working on a video for another book called The Young Hitler I Knew by August Kubizek, who recounts his and Hitler's childhoods in Austria. And from the sound of that book, the tension that led up to World War I was palpable, almost inevitable. I do want to mention, in H.G.WELLS' defense, he was self-aware about the reaction the polyandry would get. That's why in the last chapter he wrote in a character that acts like a proxy for the reader, a proxy for you and me, who questions the narrator, the main character, about the polyandry and sort of expresses his difficulty swallowing it. So H.G.WELLS knew he'd get crap for it. It should also be noted that H.G.WELLS had mistresses. He cheated on his wife. I don't know when in the timeline he did that, before or after writing this book, but yeah, there you go. Before we move on to the next book, H.G.WELLS wrote a very interesting quote that I want to mention, but I can't place anywhere else in the video. It's not relevant to anything else. He wrote, quote, The English, with much dysentery and bad poetry, and a few hundred deaths in battle, conquered the South African Boers at a gross cost of about £3,000 per head. They could have bought the whole of that preposterous imitation of a nation for a tenth of that sum. And except for a few substitutions of personalities, this group of partially corrupt officials in the place of that, and so forth, the permanent change was altogether insignificant. Number 4 is The Invisible Man. If you want to watch an accurate film adaptation of this book, The Invisible Man, don't watch the 2020 Elizabeth Moss adaptation. Instead, watch the 2021 Netflix documentary on Richard Ramirez, aka the Night Stalker, the serial killer, who terrorized LA in the late 80s. If Mark Twain predicted World War I in Connecticut Yankee, then H.G.WELLS accurately predicted the Night Stalker's demise, which is the same demise the Invisible Man had in the book. It was another instance in which life imitated art, and it was a really, really moving ending. To be honest, the only part I enjoyed in that book was the ending. The beginning was too slow. Wells took a long time to gradually hint and reveal the premise of the book. The Invisible Man is now ubiquitous in our folklore. Everyone knows what that's about. Maybe back then people would have found it suspenseful, but that was my impression of it, at least. And sure enough, I looked it up and found out this book started as a short story titled The Man at the Coach and Horses, which Wells ended up extending. So that explains it. Here I am complaining that the beginning was too dragged out, and it turns out to have been a self-contained short story that was later extended into a whole book. In terms of depth and symbolism, I didn't find much of any. Similar to In the Days of the Comet, I got kind of a Crime and Punishment, Nietzschean Übermensch vibe. I think it does have at least more social commentary than First Man in the Moon and Food of the Gods, but I didn't pick up much on it. It's funny, I read the whole book thinking there was no symbolism anywhere. And then I looked up Course Hero, and they explained a really, really, really deep religious reference to the Pentecost from the New Testament. So not only was there symbolism, but it was really esoteric. Still, though, that was it. I couldn't find anything after that. I've seen a number of interpretations of The Invisible Man, and I personally think they're overanalyzing its political message. And also projecting. The one I found really annoying was that YouTube channel Extra Credit, calling this book H.G. Wells' anti-libertarian novel. I don't think their understanding of the book is wrong. I think their attribution of libertarianism is wrong. Almost always when I hear someone label something as collectivist or as an example of individualism, they're making an arbitrary and subjective distinction, but that's neither here nor there. I do agree with Course Hero, though, about the motif of technology bringing about a new era. Like I said before, this motif is also present in Food of the Gods with the food, and in the Days of the Comet with the comet, and maybe an era of torment with the Invisible Man. All I can say is, after reading this book, I finally understood why the Invisible Man is often grouped together with Dracula and the Wolfman in terms of Halloween costumes, besides the obvious reason, the old black and white movies. I always thought the Invisible Man was the odd one out, but now I see it isn't. Number 3 is War of the Worlds. It becomes readily apparent to those who read this book that H.G. Wells was a very skilled writer. My only problem I had with it was that it was kind of hard to understand at some parts. It demands that you mentally visualize a lot of scenes, a lot of imagery, and it uses a lot of very British vernacular that I had no context for, and so a lot of the time I had trouble visualizing what was going on. It's not just Britishisms. This book name drops a ton of British cities, where you can pull out a map and actually trace the character's journey. I heard Steven Spielberg's movie adaptation of War of the Worlds was his attempt at a movie where modern Americans were portrayed as refugees. And of course, that was also H.G. Wells' intentions when he wrote this book. This book is meant to portray the Brits as the victims of colonialism from alien invaders. My personal guess is he added all the geographical details so that it would be that much more relatable to the British readers. Maybe, maybe not. In any event, he was living in Woking at the time when he was writing the book, which takes place in Woking and its surrounding areas. The biggest message I took away from this book, though, me personally, was how the authorities, people in power, and the main protagonist at first will be in complete denial of overwhelming calamities in society, like an alien invasion. The bureaucrats were very inept in this book. After reading this book, I do think we owe Spielberg an apology. You see, one of the biggest criticisms people have given his War of the Worlds movie is the scene where Tom Cruise's son goes over a hill, which is then engulfed with flames, and so viewers are led to believe the son died, and then he just shows up at the end of the movie alive, without any explanation of how the son survived, a la Deus Ex Machina. There's a parallel to that in the book. I won't tell you who, but there's an example where such and such character showed up at the end without any explanation. So Spielberg was actually staying true to the book when he added that Deus Ex Machina, but he got a lot of crap for that. In terms of parallels with the other books by H.G. Wells, the scene where the artilleryman plans to go underground reminded me of the Morlocks from The Time Machine. And of course, the biggest parallel with the other books by H.G. Wells was the motif of hard times create strong men create good times create weak men create hard times. This motif is very prominent in H.G. Wells' books. I'll let you find out yourself what the hard times were in the book. Number 2 is The Time Machine. This book was H.G. Wells' prediction for the future. I will remind you, H.G. Wells was a raging socialist. And of all his works I read, this might be the most socialist-laden plot, even more so than in the Days of the Comet, where he literally made the main character a socialist. I like H.G. Wells, but I personally don't really like that he was such an ardent socialist. But this book was published in 1895, way before even the Bolshevik Revolution, let alone the fall of the Berlin Wall. Although, to be fair, he lived till 1946, so he got as far as the tip of the beginning of Stalinist Russia. And also he was a Fabian socialist, which means he wanted slow, gradual changes towards socialism as opposed to a big revolution. So here, he wrote a story about a time traveler who travels to the future. He arrives at a time in the future inhabited by 2 human-like species, the Morlocks, which dwell underground, tough, with white hair, eyes sensitive to light, and intelligent enough to operate machinery. The other species was the Eloi, living above ground, plump, small, childlike, dumb, and happy. They're too dumb to take care of themselves and just play and eat fruit all day. In the future, all disease has been eradicated, so that wasn't a worry for them. The time traveler in the plot becomes very attached to one of the Eloi, a female, named Weena. He concludes that the Morlocks evolved from the hard-working poor, who were relegated underground, and he concludes the Eloi descended from the idle rich. So H.G. Wells was saying that this separation in the future was a result of our current class division. Class division had intensified and heightened to the point of evolving 2 separate species, where each of their characteristics had become pronounced to an extreme. The main takeaway from The Time Machine is basically the quote I just read from the previous book I mentioned, War of the Worlds. It's the same moral. Hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. Here's why this is one of the main themes, and this is a spoiler, so you have to decide if you want to skip to the next book or you want to keep listening. But if you decide to skip and you ever read the book, then remember this video. Anyways. Okay, here comes the spoilers. The time traveler discovers that the poor are literally eating the rich. You see, the time traveler discovers that the Morlock periodically ascend above ground at night to pick a few Eloi to eat. The story gets really suspenseful at this point, and that's mostly why this is such a good book, and one of H.G. Wells' best books. This is a very suspenseful book. It's engrossing. My interpretation of the plot, which I don't think goes along with most people's view, the Eloi were basically the Morlocks' cattle. Since it's explained in the book that the Morlocks would clothe them and make their sandals for them and take care of them in other ways, the Eloi were too dumb to take care of themselves, so the Morlocks were kind of their caretakers. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine if aliens came to Earth, but most of the Earth's surface is ocean, right? So imagine the aliens come straight to the ocean and try to make peace talks with the fishes. I mean, who really rules the Earth? There's more ants on Earth than humans, for example. There was a book I read once, actually. It was titled Biography of a Germ, which is sort of a biography of the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. Very, very interesting book. I really liked it. But the author explained that Lyme disease bacteria will probably outlive humanity. Now, if this is true, then who's really winning? Are we really the masters of Earth? Anyways, long story short, that's basically what happened here. The time traveler visited the future, encountered the Morlocks' cattle, basically, and really took it personal that they were getting eaten. It's kind of dumb that he took it so personal. And even he, the time traveler, even he made that comment in the book. Because intelligent-wise, the Morlocks were closer to humans since they could operate machinery, and the Eloi were closer to pets. But here's the trick. The Eloi looked closer to humans. As Wells wrote, quote, "The Eloi kept too much of their human form," end of quote. Well, now we're diving into the green beard effect and altruism in the context of the selfish gene. Wells made both the Eloi and the Morlocks descendants of humans, which is poetic, the duality of man, but he made us empathize with the Eloi, the descendants of the idle rich, who now had become defenseless cattle. Another theme is the observation that the time traveler leaped 800,000 years into the future and still encountered division and power struggle where the strong exploit the weak. Man will always be divided and in fact will devolve as a species. Our technology will plateau and good times will create weak men. At one point, the time traveler says he realized after the fact how ill-equipped he went into the future. He didn't even bring a gun with him because he assumed the people of the future would be equipped with all kinds of intelligence and medicine and comforts. But of course, he was mistaken. I did some research for this video by reading the wiki on the time machine, and they have a section in the article where they list all the fan-made sequels. I can't find it now, but I thought I read one of the fan-made sequels, so a sequel to the time machine written by someone other than H.G.WELLS, had a plot where the time traveler goes back to the future and finds out he unintentionally reintroduced previously eradicated diseases that were killing off both the Eloi and the Morlocks, which makes total sense. H.G.WELLS explicitly explained all the diseases had been eradicated in the future, and he definitely appreciated the devastation of germs, the humblest things God put upon this earth. So I wonder if H.G.WELLS ever made that connection. Here comes another spoiler. I interpreted the ending to be nihilistic. The reader, we all, get really attached to Weena, the Eloi. And the time traveler also gets really attached to her, but unfortunately, she dies, or at least that's what we're led to believe. We don't really know. And once the time traveler is able to escape the Morlocks, he travels further into the future. At this point, he encounters the end of time, and in the end of time, he sees like a giant white butterfly and a giant crab-like creature, and it's like, after experiencing this huge loss of Weena and feeling so depressed about it, he travels to the same Earth, surrounded with no trace of humanity. We can't relate to a giant white butterfly, and Earth is no longer our home, and everyone we care about are dead, and in the great scheme of things, none of that matters. He kind of had that same epiphany earlier while staring at the constellations right before he realized what the meat in the Morlock dwelling was. Quote, "And during these few revolutions, all the activity, all the traditions, the complex organizations, the nations, languages, literatures, aspirations, even the mere memory of man as I knew him, had been swept out of existence. Instead were these frail creatures who had forgotten their high ancestry, and the white things of which I went in terror." Number 1 is the Island of Dr. Moreau. I know this is a huge upset. Most people would have probably said the Time Machine is number 1. But the Island of Dr. Moreau, in my opinion, was leagues better. It was a masterpiece. Don't get me wrong, it's not a perfect book. In fact, parts of it are kind of boring. More specifically, the entire first half. You could literally start reading the book from the midpoint, and you wouldn't miss out on anything of value. Like The Invisible Man, you could just read the title, glance at the cover art, and you know exactly what this book is about without reading any of the introductory chapters, which is the first half of the book. I felt that way even more after watching the Simpsons spoof on the Island of Dr. Moreau. If you've ever seen the Simpsons Halloween special, you probably know the basic premise of the book. But the Simpsons actually changed a very crucial detail about the book, which completely changes the moral of the story. So that was nice of them not to completely spoil the plot. If H.G.WELLS predicted chemical warfare with War of the Worlds, then the Island of Dr. Moreau predicted the exile of the Shah of Iran, or maybe the fall of Baghdad, or maybe the Haitian Revolution. Apologies if you're actually from Iran or Iraq or Haiti and you think I'm way off base about those events. If you combined Animal Farm, Frankenstein, Lord of the Flies, Heart of Darkness, and the ending of Inception into one book, you would have a masterpiece. You would have this book, and that's what reading this book was like. Throughout the whole book, I was reminded of Animal Farm. It was like a sequel to Animal Farm where the animals had grown the farm and taken over the whole world. I also did not expect it to be as religious as it was. The only other book of H.G.WELLS that I read which dealt with religion was War of the Worlds with the insane clergyman. And there was that really random reference to the Pentecost in the Invisible Man. But this one, The Island of Dr Moreau, was really heavy with the religious undertones. The parallels to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, hint, the modern Prometheus, the parallels to Heart of Darkness, and the reference to Plato's Noble Lie. This was a very deep book. And that's probably why I liked it so much, why this was my favorite book of his, because it alludes to Plato's Noble Lie. And even though I'm an atheist, I do believe in the merits of Plato's Noble Lie. I do believe Christianity serves a useful purpose. Even though it's lies, I do really believe it's the lie we need to believe in as a society. We need a Dr. Moreau. In conclusion, I really enjoyed this book. The feel to it, the imagery, the animals. You miss the animals. You miss them. The island is a terrifying place that you want to return to and you feel nostalgic for. It was really a masterpiece, So that's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you commented, if you subscribed, thank you guys. That's very encouraging for me. I hope you guys do well in your homework. And I'm going to have a video coming up on The Virtue of Selfishness by Ayn Rand. I know I mentioned it in the days of the Comet. I'm going to try to take a devil's advocate defending her. So I hope you guys tune in for that. And again, thanks for listening.